Hello and welcome to Mr. Manley History Teacher's video on the Manchurian Crisis. So during this session we're going to be looking at another example of a failure of the League of Nations. And this was an event that took place from the early to mid 1930s, and in fact it sort of links in with the start of the Second World War. Now this session is part of the GCSE AQA history specification and is essentially a case study on why the League of Nations failed in the 1930s. And the other main case study that I've mentioned in one of my other videos is the Abyssinian Crisis. So it's really the Manchurian Crisis and the Abyssinian Crisis you need to know in detail for your GCSE history assessment for the conflict and tension paper. So what challenges did the League face in the 1930s? A lot of these challenges really originated from the Great Depression, which started out with the Wall Street crash in America in the late 1920s and then had a knock-on effect with the Great Depression in countries all around the world. So the Manchurian Crisis, as I mentioned, started in 1931 and really carried on until 1937. The Abyssinian Crisis, involving Italy and Abyssinia in 1935 and 1936. And also another crisis that you don't really need to know too much about as part of the AQA history specification is the Spanish Civil War, which occurred between 1936 and 1939 between nationalists and socialists pretty much in Spain, and in the end the nationalists won. But like I said, you don't need to know too much about the Spanish Civil War as part of your AQA GCSE specification. So how was Japan affected by the Great Depression? Well, Japan, as you may know already, depending on what your geography is like, is an island and it has limited resources. It doesn't have too many natural resources like coal or oil or iron or rubber. So it needs to import them or gain them from other countries. Now, Japan had been badly hit by the Depression of the early 1930s. Foreigners didn't really buy, so other countries didn't really buy Japanese goods. And without sales, Japan couldn't really afford to buy raw materials it needed from other countries. And there are countries in Asia which can supply them with these goods, like rubber, for example, is in the sort of can be found in Malaysia and the Philippines. So they weren't resources that were too far away from Japan. They're in easy reach geographically. Now, the armed forces in Japan had become increasingly strong in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and even though Japan was a democracy, the military pretty much ran the government, and they wanted to get rid of any influence from America or the British and French empires in Europe. They wanted Japan to have sort of sole control over countries in East Asia. Japan also had a growing population of 70 million people, but it didn't have enough land to feed everyone. So it was looking to expand. In 1914, the Japanese had captured Germany's Chinese colonies, but had to give them back after the war. And Japan felt that, China was nearby geographically and it should have a say in what was going on in countries nearby, rather than Germany, which is a European country, controlling parts of China. So after those problems that we had seen on the previous slide that Japan encountered as a result of the Great Depression, it needed an excuse or a scapegoat to start its expansion into a nearby country. And this happened with the Mukden incident in September 1931, where basically the Japanese army fabricated an explosion on the South Manchurian Railway. Now, the South Manchurian Railway was actually Japanese controlled. However, the Japanese and China allowed Japan to have the railway. However, Japan claimed that China was now attacking the Japanese controlled railway there. So the Japanese army, in response, essentially was sent to Manchuria and took over the region. Okay, don't forget, Manchuria is a region of China. The people of Japan were ecstatic. The Japanese army claimed this as a huge victory. However, the Japanese government wasn't really particularly happy with this. They didn't go along with it themselves. Don't forget, the army, as we previously mentioned, in Japan pretty much had control over foreign policy. So as a result, in 1932, Japan renamed Manchuria Manchukuo. So they've pretty much put a Japanese name on it now to basically show that they're in charge. And they put a man called Pu Yi, an ex-Chinese emperor who had been thrown out of power in 1911, in charge as a puppet ruler. They controlled his every move pretty much. Okay, so this is the spark that set off the Manchurian Crisis. Now, China appealed to the League of Nations for help, and the League could have responded in a number of different ways. So it could have potentially placed economic sanctions on Japan. It could have basically given moral condemnation, which is basically telling Japan to leave Manchuria. It could have tried to establish military intervention to force Japan to leave Manchuria, or it could have done nothing. Maybe have a think to yourself about what you think the League of Nations would do in response to Japan. Don't forget, Japan is a member of the Council of the League of Nations. It's one of the 4 members of the Council, along with Britain, France, and Italy. So it holds quite a lot of sway in the League of Nations. Now, here's what the League of Nations decided to do. By February 1932, Japan had conquered Manchuria and put its puppet emperor in charge. In January until March 1932, Japan actually captured Shanghai, a key Chinese city. What the League decided to do was to send an ambassador called Lord Lytton to Manchuria to decide what course of action should be taken. However, if you look at the timeline we've got here now, he actually arrives 2 months after Japan has conquered Manchuria. So he comes a lot later, he arrives a lot later. And he arrives, here we go, in April 1932. Bit late to the party there, Lord Lytton. Now, the League's delegation declared that Japan should leave Manchuria. So they basically say to Japan, you have no right to be here, you should not be in charge, you should not be in control. And the League voted against Japan in February 1933. So this is, a long time after Lord Lytton has arrived in Manchuria, and it's an even longer time, so over a year, since Japan has actually conquered Manchuria. So a year later, the League votes against Japan. So all Japan does in response is merely walk out of the League of Nations. The League doesn't even agree on sanctions, and no army is sent. Surprise, surprise, but the League doesn't have its own army anyway. Now, this makes the League of Nations look extremely weak, and as a consequence of this, in July 1937, Japan invades the rest of China. So this is a monumental failure for the League of Nations with regards to the Manchurian Crisis. Thanks so much for listening, and hope you listen to some more of my videos soon.